Those who labor among us under the banner of the esteemed, I should not attempt to call all of the names because time certainly will not permit. To members of the bishopric and the general clergy from various apostolic and even non-apostolic organizations, to officers and members of the Bethesda Church, to members of the Johnson family, both immediate and extended. To my childhood friends, Jackie, Sharon, Reuben, Brenda, and Laverne. And finally, to my dear friend and angel of mercy, the beautiful Lady Juana Cox. My wife and I certainly wish you well during this journey. May God bless you. Those of you who attended the 65th anniversary banquet of Bishop Johnson 3 weeks ago tomorrow, you may recall some of the things I said in my opening salutations. And again, I find myself in this dubiously conflicted and conflictedly dubious predicament again today. And even though the nervous quotient is somewhat higher than it was 3 weeks ago, there is a joyous relief in the nature of today's gathering. That is not to say that there is not a high degree of sadness associated with the reason for which we are gathered here today. But on the other hand, there is an absolute joy in knowing that at long last, Bishop Johnson is truly resting in the presence of the God whom he loved so dearly, and to whom he devoted every fiber of his being, from the start until the finish. While copious tears may visit our thoughts of loneliness that are occasioned by his absence, those fears are offset by the overwhelming excitement that accompanies our awareness that he can now look upon the face of God. And as much as we have all striven in one way or another to emulate his life, his passing has surely raised a new bar that all of us must strive to achieve. We must strive to live as did he, to see Jesus one day. No matter how much we love him, no matter how much we care and cared about him, we must not begrudge him his right to see his Lord. As I remarked at the start of my discourse during the bishop's 65th anniversary banquet, I say again, I am extremely grateful for the confidence that my mentor turned friend has expressed in me by directing that I speak on his behalf at such an occasion as this. In the face, of course, of more noble clerics, I feel both unworthy and unqualified to do so. Nevertheless, here we are. Please note that I am not standing here as the diocesan of the Episcopal Diocese of Mid-America. I do not stand here as a member of the Executive Board of Bishops of the International Bible Way Church. I do not stand behind this sacred desk as the former president of America's most prestigious ecumenical conference of African American ministers, the Hampton University's Ministers Conference. But rather, I stand here as Bishop Johnson's friend. While I saw Bishop Johnson all of my life as my mentor, at some point he saw me as his friend. I remember several years ago, Bishop James Johnson and the late Bishop Norman Wagner and myself were riding in the back of a limousine being driven from one point to another here in St. Louis. We were all sitting in silence, just pondering the events of the meeting that we had just left. Bishop Johnson, in his own inimitable way, broke the silence by saying, "I am one of the most blessed men around. Here I am," he said, "sitting in one of the finest cars made in America." I think we were in a Lincoln Stretch limousine, sitting between my two best friends in the world. I stand here as Bishop Johnson's friend. Bishop Johnson's choice of me to eulogize him is not some kind of political statement designed to show anyone up, but rather it speaks to his value on friendship. I stand as Bishop Johnson's friend. More than 26 years ago, after the death of my late wife, I suffered an evening of extreme melancholy. He called me that evening just to see how I was doing in light of my situation and his knowledge of my situation. I imagined that he could tell by my response that I was having one of those I can't deal with this moments, without regard to the fact that it was almost midnight. Without being asked or prodded in any way, he simply said, "I'll be there." He did not say, "I'm in bed, it's almost midnight, I'll see you in the morning." He said, "I'll be there." He could have said, listen, let me take a couple hours. I need to get dressed and wash up and I'll see you in a little bit. He did not say that. He said, "I'll be there." Within minutes, Bishop Johnson showed up at my house, just a couple of streets away from his. He came in his pajamas, his robe, and his house shoes. I stand as Bishop Johnson's friend. In the face of the distinguished leaders who are present today, I concede that perhaps I am not the most qualified, so please indulge me as I ponder alone. I would like to do so under the topic of, why is it important for saints to live righteously? Why is it important for saints to live righteously? And inasmuch as I'm speaking eulogistically, let me be more direct by rephrasing the question. Why was it important for Bishop Johnson to live the way he did? I want to begin this discourse by raising and by examining the questions raised of Job and vicariously of God by Job's well-intentioned friend, but most misguided, Bildad in Job 25:4. Even though Bildad's questions were raised out of the depth of his apprehension in regards to the plight that God allowed upon Job's life, we must consider that God's use of Job was demonstrational. By that, I am suggesting that God's purpose was to demonstrate to humanity that in life's worst predicaments, we can still uphold the righteousness of God. God, through Job's testimony, shows the world that even in the most difficult of circumstances, our capacity to please God is consistently reinforced by the grace of God. Listen, if you will, to the anguish in Bildad's voice as he questions the righteous integrity of God. I use the phrase righteous integrity because it confirms in some small way that whatever God does is done in a spirit of divine appropriateness. It is incumbent upon us to witness It is incumbent rather upon our witness for God that we understand that God's purpose in all things is to solidify his relational sovereignty in the presence of our humanity. While our humanity is not God's main consideration, God's sovereignty must always be our main consideration. Job in this text is described as a man who was perfect and upright. He was described as one that feared or respected, reverenced God. He was described as a man who deliberately avoided and abstained from all that was evil. And I might add a commentary that just by knowing humanity, it is important to note that Job abstained and avoided even those things that had the appearance of evil so that he could live righteously. He was a blessed man, but he is most noted for the fact that he lived righteously. Note, my brother and my sister, that it was not Job's behavior that brought about his problem. It was not any careless disregard of God's character that caused Job's problem. It was not an acceptance of worldly philosophies that caused his problems, but rather it was God's praise of Job that prompted Satan to challenge Job and thus challenge God's integrity. Job's question, Job's suggestion was that, or rather Satan's, through Bildad's suggestion, was that Job served God strictly because of God's blessings and protection upon his life. God decided to show us. He removed that outer layer of Job's protection, which allowed Satan then to come in and take his wealth, take his children, and even his physical health was destroyed. In order to test Job's character, Satan did all that he could do. And by testing Job's character, he proved God's faithfulness. Great is his faithfulness. It's important for us to note today that despite his difficult circumstances, Job did not curse God, nor charge God foolishly. Although he agonized over his plight, he stopped short of accusing God of any kind of injustice. In the frustration of God's wager with Satan regarding his power to sustain his own, Job faced this question in 25:4. How then can man be justified with God? How can man, just to reiterate, be justified with God? How can man be clean that is born of a woman? What a series of questions. How can man be justified with God? How can man be clean that is born of a woman? A cursory observance of these questions suggests a contemporary application of a dilemma that was just as applicable 1260 BC as it is today. Here we are, 3,385 years later, and these questions still ring out with contemporary relevance. The cry of frustration can still be heard today, both within the church and outside of the church. This faithless lament can be heard from those who are the redeemed of the Lord, and it can also be heard of those who know not the Lord. It's understandable that sinners, void of any faith relationship with God, would ask such a question. But the saints are asking the same questions. In spite of being redeemed, the saints are asking the questions. In spite of the empowerment of the Holy Ghost, the saints are asking the question. In spite of the infusion of God in their lives, the saints are still raising those 3,300-year-old questions. In spite of being transformed, the saints are still asking the question, how then can a man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that is born of a woman? There seems to be within today's church a pervasive spirit of an ungodly tolerance of sin. There lives an atmosphere of a kind of stretching of grace in our behavior and in our attitudes towards God. It seems that our actions are suggesting that saints can never be justified with God. Our lifestyles are suggesting that we can never be clean. It has become commonplace to hear of pastors involved in adulterous affairs. Homosexuality and lesbianism in ministry is no longer shocking to the people of God. Drunken and drugged out preachers are rapidly becoming the norm. Scandal-free ministers are the anomaly in today's church. It has already been mentioned more than once that Bishop Johnson lived a scandal-free life. While I concede that ought to be the norm, instead, it is an anomaly. But God still expects righteous living. It is still, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it is still our reasonable service. We have reached a place where it's as if Romans 3:23 has no significance in the life of the contemporary church or its saints. Paul's declaration that God is the justifier of them that believe in Jesus seemed to fall on deaf ears and seems to have little effect on the people of God. Listen, my brother and my sister, if this is true, can you imagine what it's doing to our Christian witness? If this is true, it's no wonder that the church is shunned in many communities. If this is true, it explains why even our congregations are becoming overrun by lesbians and homosexuals. If this is true, it stands to reason that many of our preachers are looking and living like pimps and not daddies. If man cannot be justified with God, or if he that is born of a woman cannot be clean, then the church will never be able to carry out Paul's admonition to the Corinthians, where Paul poses the question, do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? Listen. It is absolutely necessary that saints live righteously. After all, the Bible says we will judge the world. It was important for Bishop Johnson to live the way he did. After all, we shall judge the world. Understand, God did not justify Bishop Johnson because of who he was, but rather because of what he would become. God did not bring Bishop Johnson to Bethesda Church because he was a well-known, polished preacher who would raise a substantial church in a major metropolitan community. Quite the contrary. When God orchestrated the transition of young James Johnson from Flint, Michigan to St. Louis, from the often whimsical uncertainties of the evangelistic field to the pastorate, He was not only unknown, but he was unpolished and inexperienced as well. But God was planting a witness. Let me say it again. God was planting a witness. God needed a man to be able to stand up. God needed to establish a judge of a man who would be able to stand up and become what God wanted him to be. God needed, because there would be those who might later say, I would have done it, but I couldn't do it God's way. God needed to establish a judge for those kind of people. So here we are, a young preacher from a relatively small town, transplanted not by his own will into a major urban city, succeeding a then powerhouse of a preacher in the person of the late Morris Golder, destined to take a small emerging church and grow it into one of PAW's leading congregations. Brother and sister, God needed a man who had the courage to act on his faith commitment to the ways of righteousness. God needed a man who would dare to be justified with God. God needed a man, though born of a woman, but who was clean before God. God needed a man who was not just clean, but a man who would dare to have the audacity to stay clean. 65 years in pastoral ministry, 65 years in an urban city, 65 years going in and out. God needed a man who would dare to stay clean. God needed a witness. It wasn't for James Johnson that God acted upon James Johnson and justified James Johnson, cleaning James Johnson up so that James Johnson could then stand as a judge to the rest of the preacher world. No, James Johnson had to live the way he lived. He had no choice. I know that he was often criticized. He was shared with me from time to time. He was often criticized by those who refused to live within their justification, criticized for the straight manner in which he lived. Some weak preachers avoided him because he dared to disagree with their reckless behavior, even though they operated under the same banner as he did. But like Bishop Johnson, we can live within the realm of the justified. Like Bishop Johnson, they can live as those who have been cleansed by the power of God. Like Bishop Johnson, they could live for the purpose of God. And I know that some preachers have enlisted into ministry to see what they can get out of it. But Johnson was drafted into ministry so that we could see what God could get out of it. While others are trying to make ministry work for them, Johnson made it work for God. Some ministers are caught up in secondary pursuits that distract them from their primary mission. Their hustle has taken over their purpose. But God's pursuit was Johnson's mission, and Johnson's pursuit was God's mission. Other pastors become involved in politics that subject their ministry to political expediency. But my brother and my sister, Johnson's ministry was his politics, and his politics were his ministry. For those of you or those of us who are so involved in social causes that their energy for ministry and the preparation of ministry is short-circuited by social busyness, Johnson stands as a judge that proved that they could have used their energy in God's way. Pastors who allow spin-off occupations to take center stage to the point that ministry is choked out. This God-made witness stands as God's judge against them. Do you not know, Paul asked, that the saints shall judge the world? I'm almost done. And finally, those preachers who are consumed in popularity contests that render them ineffective as gospel preachers, and for whom the cross of Christ has been replaced by trinkets of success, Johnson stands as a judge. The problem that these leaders, pastors and bishops will experience in judgment is the witness that has been established by God and confirmed by the life and ministry of men and women like James Johnson. Johnson has proven that you don't have to become absorbed in self-aggrandizing practices and activities to have a successful ministry. Johnson has proven that we don't have to become amateur politicians to build a church for the Lord. Johnson has proven that we don't have to subject our ministry to political expediency to be ministerially expedient. Johnson has proven that we don't have to become involved in mission distracting secondary pursuits to be effective pastors. And on the top of my list, Johnson has proven that we don't have to expend our energies in various social causes, even though they be for the purpose of equal and civil rights, in an effort to make a name for ourselves. Johnson has proven that we don't have to risk choking our ministry with spin-out occupations to keep up with the economic demands of life. Johnson has proven that we don't have to become consumed in popularity contests to gain community acceptance. Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? Well, my brother and my sister, if you listen carefully, if you listen with the ears of your soul, you can hear Jesus say, "Well done, Johnson, thou good and faithful servant." I'm almost done, but let me tell you, thou hast been faithful over a few things, but I will make you ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord. I don't know about you, my brother and sister, but my heart longs to see Jesus. My soul pants for Jesus. I can hear the refrain of that old spiritual song that wells up in my own spirit. It said, "Oh, I want to see him, to look upon his face, there to sing forever of God's saving grace. On the streets of glory, let me lift my voice. Cares all pass, home at last, ever to rejoice." Can't you hear it? Can't you hear it, my brother? As I journey through the land, singing as I go, pointing souls to Calvary, to the crimson flow. Many arrows pierce my soul, from without within. This is Johnson's testimony. But my Lord leads me on. Through him I must win. Can't you hear Bishop Johnson singing? Can't you hear him, Sister Warner? Jackie, Sharon, and Reuben, can't you hear him? Can't you hear your daddy, Brenda and Laverne? Can't you hear him, church? Can't you hear him singing and saying out loud, "Oh, I had to live. I had to live the way I did. I had to live right. I had to be a righteous preacher. I could have just went along to get along, but I had to do it God's way. I could have just done my own thing in the community where I lived, but I had to do it God's way. I'm going to get out of here now." But you got to understand, my sister and brother, you have to live right. I don't care what kind of pressure they put on you. I don't care what the crowd is doing. When you see others advancing in the wrongdoing,
Don't be tempted. Don't look around at the prosperity of the wicked and find your feet almost slipping. Stand up for Jesus. You soldiers of the cross. It must not suffer banner. It must not suffer loss. Stand up, dear saints. Live out of the creed. For contrary to what other people are saying, contrary to what other preachers live like, contrary to the status quo, understand that you can walk with Jesus. You can be saved. You can hold up the bloodstained banner. You can be a Johnson. I dare you to be a Daniel. I dare you to stand alone. I dare you to have a purpose firm. I dare you to make it known. Stand up for Jesus. I want to see him. That's what Johnson is saying. I want to see him. If I want to see him, I've got to live like I want to see him. I've got to walk like I want to see him. I've got to act like I want to see him. I've got to live like I want to see him. When the lights are out at night, when the curtains are drawn and the bedroom is dark, I've got to stand for the same principles because, I want to see him, to look upon his face and there to sing forever, not just 90 years, not just 65 years, but forever, of the saving grace. Oh my God, prayers all past, cares all past, free from sin and shame. I want to live so I can see him.